have you ever doubted the fact that you are autistic enough to be diagnosable? And that's whether you're clinically diagnosed or not. If the answer is yes, this might be the video for you. I still have moments where I worry I'm not truly autistic enough to use the label. Sometimes it's triggered by the fact that I have quite a positive social interaction one day, or maybe I meet someone who seems like they have more obvious struggles than I do. One thing that I don't think helps very much is that the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for autism, it feels very cold. I mean, I understand how and why I meet that diagnostic criteria, but as I said in the past, it's hard to see a real human in there, in all those words, those wordy words they use. And it's of course very negative. They're looking at autism through this medicalized lens of disorder. But what if I told you there are actually pages and pages of additional information about autism available to diagnosticians? We're not just the basic diagnostic criteria that most of us are probably quite familiar with. And you can find this in the most recent version of the DSM-5. And I think this additional information does a way better job of emphasizing the diversity of the autistic spectrum. In fact, some of it was too close to home. Some of it made me feel attacked. Stop reading my diary, you weirdos. So today, let's try and destroy some imposter syndrome. Let's go through 11 signs that you are in fact autistic enough to be diagnosed autistic, using a bit of extra context provided by the American Psychiatric Association. Or maybe that's better phrased as 11 things that wouldn't exclude you from being diagnosed autistic, provided you also met the main diagnostic criteria for ASD. Number 1, you can still be autistic enough to be diagnosable, even if some people, maybe even most people you come across on a day-to-day basis, think you're too sociable, too socially capable to be autistic. Especially if those people only get to know you on a surface level, which, I mean, let's face it, how many people really get to know you beyond that? When I was very freshly diagnosed, I had to go to the hospital for an allergy test, and while the doctor was busy prodding my arm with needles, we made small talk, and I decided that I was going to tell her that I was autistic, just sprinkle it into conversation somewhere. Partly because I often do appear quite anxious when I'm having procedures done to me, especially when I'm not fully informed about what's going to be happening to my body, which is sadly often the case, I find. Basically, I wanted to test the waters and see if a stranger, and I mean quite an important stranger at that, a stranger who was putting needles into my skin, I wanted to see if she would believe me. And you might not be surprised to learn that it didn't really change anything about the experience. She said I seemed too sociable to be autistic, basically, and seemed pretty skeptical. But the thing is, the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria acknowledges that some autistic people will not look autistic. This is of course because of autistic masking, the ability that many of us have to cover up our autistic traits. The diagnostic features section of the DSM-5 informs diagnosticians that, and apologies, there's a lot of language here that I wouldn't choose to use. Personally, they really like the word impairment. Individuals without cognitive or language impairment may have more subtle manifestation of deficits. That's in both criterion A and criterion B, than individuals with accompanying intellectual or language impairments and may be making great efforts to mask these deficits. Criterion A deficits in social communication will be more subtle if an individual has better overall communication skills, e.g. is verbally fluent, does not have intellectual impairments. So basically, individuals with lower support needs and the ability to speak fluently may hit the diagnostic criteria, and in particular the social stuff, in a subtler way. They are also clear to stress that this can be an exhausting process for autistic people. Individuals who have developed compensation strategies, so that's masking, still struggle in novel or unsupported situations and suffer from the effort and anxiety of consciously calculating what is socially intuitive for most individuals. This behavior may contribute to lower ascertainment of autism spectrum disorder in these individuals, perhaps especially in adult women. Thus, longer assessments, observation in naturalistic settings, and inquiring about any tolls of social interaction may be needed. If asked about the cost of social interaction, for example, these individuals might respond that social interactions are exhausting for them, that they are unable to concentrate because of the mental effort in monitoring social conventions, that their self-esteem is adversely affected by being unable to be themselves, and so forth. Many adults report using compensation strategies and coping mechanisms to mask their difficulties in public, but suffer from the stress and effort of maintaining a socially acceptable facade. So the allergy doctor's impression of me was not necessarily incorrect, but also a subtler presentation doesn't make you any less autistic, according to the American Psychiatric Association. If you'd like to know a little bit more about autistic masking and compensation, how to know if you're doing it, the three main types of masking, I will link my video about that on screen and down below. I also think it's important to note that somebody having what they call here language impairments or an intellectual disability doesn't necessarily mean that person doesn't mask at all. We still need more research into how autistic people all over the spectrum mask their traits. That's something that's acknowledged in this book, Autism and Masking, How and Why People Do It, and the impact it can have, which I would definitely recommend, and I'll leave a link down below. But yes, plenty of people who seem socially capable and who are socially capable, who have learned how to socialize effectively, are also autistic people. Because number two, you can still be autistic enough to be diagnosable if you are able to learn stuff. Even if you are not exactly the same and do not present in exactly the same way that you did as a child. Who would have thought it? It may sound ridiculously obvious, but I still think so many people see autism as a children's condition. It's often all primary colors and puzzle pieces and superpowers. People forget that autistic people, no matter their presentation and support needs, will grow up. No matter what our starting point is, we will continue to learn new skills and to adapt. We might consciously or unconsciously, as a kind of survival response, develop strategies to cope with a world that doesn't really fit very well with our neurology. We might watch the people around us who seem to be having an easier time than we are and try and be more like them. As the DSM-5 states under the heading Development and Course, autism spectrum disorder is not a degenerative disorder, and it is typical for learning and compensation to continue throughout life. So again, masking and putting in extra effort to learn skills that aren't innate for us. It goes on, symptoms are often most marked in early childhood and early school years, with developmental gains typical in later childhood in at least some areas, e.g. increased interest in social interaction. A small proportion of individuals deteriorate behaviorally during adolescence. I mean, I suppose I did have my big autistic burnout during that time. I think it can be a very stressful time for many autistic people, whereas most others improve. If any diagnostician tries to suggest that you are not autistic because you're not a child anymore, you don't spend all day meticulously lining up your toys as you maybe did as a child, or you've perhaps learned to understand sarcasm through trial and error, point that diagnostician in the direction of the DSM-5. Autistic people are people. We have a neurodevelopmental condition, but we still develop. Number 3, I'm gonna keep shouting this one from the rooftops until the day that I die. The amount of times I still hear from people who have been told they cannot possibly be autistic, or maybe have been denied a referral from their GP on the grounds that they can make eye contact. Let's just clear this up. Nowhere in the DSM-5 does it say that you must have a complete inability to make eye contact in order to be diagnosed autistic. What does it actually say? Let's take a look. In the main diagnostic criteria, they use the phrase abnormalities in eye contact and body language. And this appears as just one example of what they call deficits in nonverbal communication. As I say, one example in a list of other examples of ways in which this trait may manifest. So abnormalities in eye contact is not a requirement in order to be diagnosed. And the DSM-5 later refers to atypical use of eye contact. Again, to me at least, atypical eye contact does not mean complete inability. Some autistic people might compensate by being overly conscious of eye contact and give too much of it and stare people down in a way that can be a bit unnerving. Or people may compensate by looking elsewhere on someone's face, looking between their eyes, looking at their mouth instead. The DSM-5 goes on, impairment may be relatively subtle within individual modes, e.g., someone may have relatively good eye contact when speaking, but noticeable in poor integration of eye contact, gesture, body posture, prosody, and facial expression for social communication, or in difficulty maintaining these for sustained periods of time, or when under stress. So maybe your eye contact is good in short bursts or when you first meet people and then it kind of starts to trail off. Or maybe your eye contact is good, but it's difficult for you to focus on maintaining that eye contact while also monitoring your tone and your facial expression. And maybe socializing just feels a bit like juggling for you. And maybe kind of other aspects of your social persona have to suffer in order for you to maintain that good eye contact. If any of that resonates with you, you might like my video on monotropism, which is my favorite theory of autism. I love the way that theory explains why social stuff can be difficult for us. So the eye contact stuff is not just as simple as autistic people can never make eye contact. No autistic person in the history of the universe has ever successfully made eye contact. If a doctor acts like that's the case, then run in the opposite direction and go and get yourself a second opinion, because that's not correct. Number 4, in a similar vein, you can still hit the diagnostic criteria for autism if your body language is expressive. Have you noticed I like to use my hands quite a lot when I talk, and my wrist just cracked? Among young people and adults with fluent language, the difficulty in coordinating nonverbal communication with speech may give the impression of odd, wooden, or exaggerated body language during interactions. Sometimes people subscribe to this stereotypical idea that all autistic people are robotic, wooden, as it says in that quote, maybe speak in a monotone. And while that might sometimes be true, some autistic people can have exaggerated body language, as it acknowledges in the DSM-5. Again, this might be a compensation strategy, making up for something that doesn't feel innate. Maybe if you're someone who internalizes a lot, who would naturally appear quite blank, maybe you feel like you need to override and push past that instinct, so your gestures end up being a little bit more over the top. Or maybe for some of us, exaggerated body language is what is innate for us. For me, I think talking with my hands and doing big gestures is a form of stimming. I used to stim by flapping my hands as a child. Sometimes when you watch clips of me talking with my hands, particularly when I was a teenager, it gets very close to rocking back and forth and flapping my arms, but it's, a more kind of socially acceptable, more subtle way to do that. But I do remember recently when I reacted to that Jubilee video when they were trying to guess who was autistic and who wasn't, and Paige Leal was in it.
Although I am curious to how a toaster will actually operate, because we can actually use parts of a toaster to actually build some futuristic tools that we can better use to benefit our planet.
Awesome.
I knew you were gonna do that.
Like, I suppose in Paige's videos, you usually don't see her interact with other people, but I saw something so familiar in that video in Paige's body language and facial expressions. So anyway, don't write yourself off as not autistic if you move your body while you interact quite a lot and smile and do exaggerated facial expressions. It doesn't mean you're neurotypical, and it doesn't mean you're interacting in a neurotypical way, just because most people wouldn't recognize it as obviously autistic. But also, number 5, you are still autistic enough if you don't like to move your body in front of other people. What we call stimming, and I have a video on the many different types of autistic and non-autistic stimming, which I'll leave linked here and in the description below, but that appears in the diagnostic criteria for autism as a type of restricted and repetitive behavior. They refer to it as stereotyped or repetitive motor movements. But as the DSM-5 also acknowledges, many individuals with autism spectrum disorder without intellectual or language impairments learn to suppress repetitive behaviors in public. In these individuals, repetitive behaviors like rocking or finger flicking may serve an anxiolytic or self-soothing function. When I see the word anxiolytic, I just want to say axolotl. It just means relieves anxiety. Once again, DSM-5 is there acknowledging that autistic masking exists. Even if certain movements are super calming for you, you may work out that it's not in your best interest for you to perform these movements if it results in you being socially ostracized. That pain can be a great teacher. I flapped my hands and performed a lot of big full body movements as a child, but if you watch my home video, you see that slowly morph into me dancing and bouncing and doing more socially acceptable movements, particularly if I had friends around. There's this one video of me about 8 years old flapping my hands and kind of rocking back and forth, but I'm recording that on my own. At school, I moved my body even less. I remember feeling like almost scared to move at school in case I moved in the wrong way. I would do kind of finger flicking like this, and I would write words in the air down by my side, or I would pinch the skin on my neck in order to stim more subtly. These had nowhere near as big or as satisfying a calming effect for me as my hand flapping and the movements that were more natural to me as a child, and the movements that I still do now as soon as I'm alone. But even today, even though I have a partner, a husband who I know wouldn't care, wouldn't judge me, probably wouldn't even notice that I was stimming, I still mostly feel too much shame from times where I was called out at school for doing movements that seemed odd. So yeah, I just take a few moments each day to go and be alone in another room, go and be autistic for a moment and let the stimming out, and spend the rest of the day pinching the skin on my poor neck. Also important to note here, not all autistic people stim in the same way. You don't have to engage in rocking or finger flicking or hand flapping or any of the more stereotypical autistic stims in order to be diagnosed autistic. You actually don't even need to stim really to be diagnosed autistic. Stimming is part of criterion B, and you need to hit 2 out of the 4 restricted and repetitive behaviors. So you don't need to tick all of those boxes in order to be diagnosed. So lack of stimming or lack of obvious stimming should never be reason alone to write someone off as not autistic. Number 6, according to the DSM-5, you can still be autistic even if your special interests aren't that weird or disordered, in quotation marks. Again, one of the 4 examples of a restricted and repetitive behavior, of which you only need to hit 2 of the 4 to be diagnosed, is highly restricted intense interests that are abnormal in intensity and focus. So already it's made clear in the diagnostic criteria that it's the intensity and focus that are not neurotypical, not the subject or the category of interest. The DSM-5 also adds, similarly, criterion B deficits, i.e. restricted patterns of behavior and interest, may be less obvious if interests are closer to age-typical norms, e.g. ancient Egypt or trains as compared to wiggling a string. I do find it funny that they list trains there as an example, because that's so often seen as a super stereotypical, if not the most stereotypical autistic interest. But I suppose particularly for young boys, trains can be seen as a more age-appropriate, socially acceptable, I suppose, interest. A lot of little boy toys and clothing are very vehicle-centric. I was also quite surprised to read the DSM-5, which is a very deficit-based, medicalized, negative way of looking at autism usually, actually being kind of positive, being kind of nice about autistic special interests. Special interests may be a source of pleasure and motivation and provide avenues for education and employment later in life. The DSM-5 also states, while it was once the case that only a minority of individuals with autism spectrum disorder lived and worked independently in adulthood, as diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is made more frequently in those who have superior language and intellectual abilities, more individuals are able to find a niche that matches their special interests and skills and are thus productively employed. Again, not my favorite wording there, the implication that, oh, some autistic interests are financially lucrative and therefore we like those ones. But I guess their point here is that a person having a job, being productively employed, is not a reason to discount someone as not autistic. But anyway, even if you are able to make money from your interests, special interests can still have their downsides. It's not all sunshine and roses. Our devotion to our interests can be distressingly obsessive. I tend to have crushingly perfectionistic tendencies when it comes to the things that I love. And that doesn't necessarily get any easier if we're able to turn our interests into a job and then depend on them for our livelihood. But it is nice to see a bit of positivity in the diagnostic criteria as a treat, because yeah, mostly it's not a massively self-esteem boosting read. Number 7 follows on nicely from the last point. You can still be autistic if you are good at stuff. Don't let a medical professional dismiss you on the grounds that you have skills. The DSM-5 diagnostic criteria points to the fact that autistic people can have what they call uneven abilities. Autistic people can have super impressive skills in one area, but then really struggle in another or several. If you think about Young-woo from Extraordinary Attorney Woo, which I recently made a video about, she's this genius savant lawyer, but she also struggles with her motor skills and needs somebody else to help her open her water bottle. The DSM-5 states, many individuals with autism spectrum disorder also have intellectual and/or language impairment. Even those with average or high intelligence usually have an uneven profile of abilities. The gap between intellectual and adaptive functional skills is often large. So adaptive functioning is how well you handle the everyday demands that life throws at you, and the more difficult that is for you, the less likely you are to be able to thrive independently. This uneven profile of abilities can be super confusing for the people around us, and I think it can further serve to mask an autistic person's struggles. For example, schools will often assume someone is coping very well in all areas of life if they are thriving academically. And kind of on that point, the DSM-5 also points out extreme difficulties in planning organization and coping with change negatively impact academic achievement, even for students with above average intelligence. So intelligence doesn't always equal ability to cope well within the school system. I think people are sometimes too quick to assume that success or ability in one area must translate to most or all other areas, and then assume that maybe you're faking or just not trying hard enough in those areas that are really difficult to you, that don't come naturally to you. But I think it's more just that the brain is complicated and autistic people are complicated. So don't let your abilities in some areas of your life, maybe many areas of your life, make you feel any less worthy of your diagnosis. Yes, autistic people can be good at stuff. It is known. Number 8, you can still be diagnosed autistic if you played with other children growing up. Often, unfortunately, autistic children's play is pathologized, and sometimes within therapy, there is a push for play to become more functional, in quotation marks, whatever the hell that means. When you think of stereotypical autistic play, you might think of a child lining up their toys rather than playing with them. The diagnostic criteria also mentions a lack of imaginative play, which I didn't relate to personally. I used to flap my toys, but internally there was a whole storyline playing out. My dolls were doing all sorts of things in my head, having all sorts of imaginary adventures. However, the DSM-5 goes on to note there may be absent, reduced, or atypical social interests manifested by rejection of others, passivity, or inappropriate approaches that seem aggressive or disruptive. These difficulties are particularly evident in young children, in whom there is often a lack of shared social play and imagination, e.g., age-appropriate, flexible pretend play, and later insistence on playing by very fixed rules. And they also discuss one-sided friendships here, which unlocks a special sort of pain for me. But insistence on playing by very fixed rules, yes, this describes me. I did play with other children, particularly as I got older, but I was very rigid about it. I guess people probably would have called me bossy with my play. Not at school. At school I was very passive, but outside of school, when I was playing with my cousins who were a few years younger than me and a couple of friends I had outside of school, play sometimes really stressed me out. I was quite perfectionist about it. If we performed little dance routines that we'd made up, it had to go right. It was like life or death to me. And when I went through my quite long phase of obsessive hand washing, I would order all of my friends to wash their hands before they touched my toys, and then we'd have to re-wash our hands at multiple intervals throughout the day if I thought they did anything that might have made their hands dirty. So if we ate lunch, I just couldn't bear the thought of them touching the bread of a sandwich and then touching my Barbie dolls. Ooh, it makes me feel a bit sick even now to think about it. I don't feel like that with my stuff anymore, but I can remember how it felt. Luckily, I think my friends came to understand that that was just what I was like, and they just kind of accommodated me, and they knew intuitively that it came from a place of anxiety and not meanness. I was very, very lucky. Thank you for putting up with my intensity. If you're watching this, I appreciate you. Number 9, it is still possible for you to be autistic even if your family doesn't remember a lot about your childhood, or if you're not in contact with them, or you're not able to ask them for information about your childhood for some reason. As the DSM-5 acknowledges, some individuals come for first diagnosis in adulthood, perhaps prompted by the diagnosis of autism in a child in the family or a breakdown of relations at work or home. Obtaining detailed developmental history in such cases may be difficult, and it is important to consider self-reported difficulties. Where clinical observations suggest criteria are currently met, autism spectrum disorder may be diagnosed, particularly if supported by a history of poor social and communication skills in childhood. A compelling report, in brackets by parents or another relative, that the individual had ordinary and sustained reciprocal friendships and good nonverbal communication skills throughout childhood would significantly lessen the likelihood of a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, though hopefully they would also keep masking in mind. And also sometimes that parents remember their children very fondly and maybe kind of don't remember the difficulties so much. However, ambiguous or absent developmental information in itself is not sufficient to rule out a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. I do feel very privileged that I have quite a lot of home video to look back on. I think without that, I would feel even more imposter syndrome. Because, for example, I knew I was bad at sports as a child. The PE trauma was real, but I didn't realize I was this bad. So I guess the lesson is don't doubt your own memories or your own internal experience. It matters, and self-reported difficulties should matter to your diagnostician. I have these vlog clips that I recorded when I was about 14, and I talk about a lot of the bullying I experienced at school.
Just chilling, walking down the corridor today, and some random girl started grabbing hold of my hair. You know, there's these stupid girls who always like make fun of my hair, and they're in like the year below me.
A lot of that I just don't remember, and I kind of laughed it off at the time. I think I was just very used to it, but when I hear it now, it can be jarring, and I think, oh my goodness, if my child was experiencing that, I would be absolutely horrified. But yeah, a lot of it I've just blanked out. I just don't remember it. So if you are going to get a diagnosis and you are able to access photographs or videos or old diary entries or school reports, all of that information can be so helpful, and you can bring that along to your appointment as well. But if that information is not there for some reason, that is not reason enough on its own to not diagnose you as autistic. Number 10, you can still be diagnosed autistic if you are not white. Again, maybe sounds like it should be obvious, but there is still a gap in diagnosis rates which is acknowledged in the DSM-5. Prevalence appears to be lower among US African American, in brackets 1.1%, and Latinx children 0.8% compared with white children 1.3%, even after the effect of socioeconomic resources is taken into account. The reported prevalence of autism spectrum disorder may be affected by misdiagnosis, delayed diagnosis, or underdiagnosis of individuals from some ethno-racial backgrounds. It's also important that diagnosticians are aware of the cultural differences that can affect the manifestation of autistic traits. Culture influences the perception of autistic behaviours, the perceived salience of some behaviours over others, and the expectations for child behaviour and parenting practices. Considerable discrepancies are found in age at diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder in children from diverse ethno-racial backgrounds. Most studies find delayed diagnosis among socially oppressed ethnic and racialized children. In addition to being diagnosed later, African American children are more often misdiagnosed with adjustment or conduct disorders than are white children. And there's a whole chapter about that in Autism Missed and Misdiagnosed by Dr. Judy Eaton, a UK clinical psychologist. If you feel like you've fallen through the cracks or been misdiagnosed with something when you're actually autistic, or you just feel like you don't meet the stereotype, you feel like you're not autistic enough to be diagnosed, I think this book is an excellent read. I'll leave it linked down below in the description. Yeah, particularly if you feel like you might have been misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder, there's quite a lot of discussion of that within this book as well. And number 11, you can still be autistic if you are a woman or gender non-conforming. The DSM-5 now acknowledges that women often go undiagnosed. Globally, the male-female ratio in well-ascertained epidemiological samples appears to be 3-to-1, with concerns about under-recognition of autism spectrum disorder in women and girls. And in the section Sex and Gender-Related Diagnostic Issues, autism spectrum disorder is diagnosed 3 to 4 times more often in males than in females, and on average, age at diagnosis is later in females. In clinical samples, females tend to be more likely to show accompanying intellectual developmental disorder as well as epilepsy, suggesting that girls without intellectual impairments or language delays may go unrecognized, perhaps because of subtler manifestations of social and communication difficulties. So the fact that it seems like a higher proportion of diagnosed autistic women have higher support needs perhaps suggests that lower support needs autistic women are out there, they're just flying under the radar for some reason. Probably because diagnosticians are not used to the way in which we can present. In comparison with males, with autism spectrum disorder, females may have better reciprocal conversation and may be more likely to share interests, to integrate verbal and non-verbal behavior, and to modify their behavior by situation, despite having similar social understanding difficulties as males. Attempting to hide or mask autistic behavior, e.g. by copying the dress, voice, and manner of socially successful women. Yep, I felt a lot of pressure to learn how to do my hair and makeup when I was a teenager. May also make diagnosis harder in some females. Repetitive behaviors may be somewhat less evident in females than males on average, and special interests may have a more social, e.g. a singer, an actor, or normative in quotation marks focus, e.g. horses, while remaining unusual in their intensity. So yeah, that's what matters, the intensity. Relative to the general population, rates of gender variance have been reported to be increased in autism spectrum disorder, with higher variance in females compared with males. I also do quickly want to note that if you do have a bad diagnostic experience, according to the NICE guidelines, you can consider getting a second opinion. The NICE guideline tells medical professionals that they should consider obtaining a second opinion, including referral to another specialist autism team if necessary, if there is uncertainty about the diagnosis or if any of the following apply. And one of the things on the list is disagreement with the person, their family, partner, carers, or advocate about the diagnosis. And I remember seeing this TikTok from a woman who had been making lived experience content as a self-identified autistic woman. And then she went in for her diagnosis and was ultimately told that she couldn't be autistic because she didn't have a special interest. I obviously don't know this woman. I'm not inside her head. I'm not a medical professional, but I do know she seemed absolutely devastated by that outcome and she disagreed with it. So I hope if she still feels that way, she has sought a second opinion or that was recommended to her by a professional at the time. But hopefully you watching this, if you haven't had your assessment yet, hopefully you have a great experience first time and the diagnosticians are kind to you. It's very vulnerable. It's a very vulnerable experience. I hope this video and this information has maybe been reassuring for you. Maybe this is a video that you can return to when you have a flare-up of imposter syndrome. And if you are waiting for your assessment, maybe this brought back some more memories for you that you can note down to tell your assessor. Knowing a lot of this stuff would definitely have made me feel less like a fraud when I was anxiously sat there on the waiting list. If you missed my last video, it was about one of my favorite examples of autistic representation on TV, but I noticed that the show Extraordinary Attorney Woo does have some similarities with Sia's music, which I think a lot of people would point to as some of the worst autism representation they've ever seen. So I kind of played a bit of spot the difference in depth. It's just a nice cozy video. There's lots of plastic, whales, and dolphins. So, you know, there's a lot of horrible stuff going on in the world. You might enjoy watching that one if you need something long to stick on the background while you get something done that you don't want to do. I'll leave that one linked. And if you found this video helpful and you'd like to see more from me, you are more than welcome to. You're also more than welcome not to. But if you would like to, you are more than welcome to support me over on Patreon. If you do, you can join my Discord community where you can chat to other autistic, neurodivergent people. You don't have to be autistic to join, just have to be a nice person. I'm usually hanging around in the Taylor Swift channel. We're doing like a song of the day at the moment where we rate the song and talk about what we like and didn't like about the song. We also sometimes play Fall Guys over there. We'll probably have a poll for our next Fall Guys date very soon, so you could join us next time. And my husband's also very active on there and he's been playing a lot of the new Monster Hunter games. They've been talking about that quite a lot in video games. Yeah, just lots of different channels for lots of different interests. It's a lovely space. And also if you join, you get access to a load of exclusive videos. I have book reviews. I have a review of the Channel 4 show Patience over there, which is like 40-50 minutes long. I don't think that would be a question that somebody would be asked. Are you diagnosed or self-diagnosed?
For you diagnosed autistic or self-diagnosed maybe, or
fake disorder cringe coming alive. The autism support group, no. I'll leave a link in the description. You can have a browse and see what's available there on the different tiers. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in my next video very soon. Bye.